The last note of the sonata seemed to dissolve into the air, not disappearing, but mixing with the scent of expensive perfume, old wood, and the faint, clean smell of floor wax. The grand concert hall, a place usually reserved for hushed reverence, was now buzzing with a low, excited hum, like a beehive that had been gently shaken. It was the sound of people coming back to themselves after being transported somewhere else entirely. And in the center of it all, standing not on the stage, but in the middle of the main aisle, was the man who had taken them there. He was tall and slim, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light. His hair, streaked with distinguished gray at the temples, was styled just so, not a single strand out of place. This was Julian Vance, and the world, at least this small, gilded corner of it, revolved around him. He stood with a polite, practiced smile on his face, nodding as people approached him. To them, his smile was a beacon of warmth. To him, it was a mask. Behind his eyes, his mind was working, dissecting the evening. He had felt the audience's attention, a living thing he had controlled completely. Every crescendo had made them lean forward. Every soft, delicate passage had held them captive. He hadn't just played the piano. He had conducted their emotions with the tips of his fingers. He felt a surge of power, a familiar and satisfying thrill. He listened to the praise as it washed over him, not with humility, but with a critical ear. "A flawless performance, maestro, truly flawless," said a man in a tuxedo whose body was slightly crooked. Julian gave a slight nod. Flawless, he thought. Asterisk a good word. Technically accurate, but it lacks soul. They don't hear the risk I took in the third movement. They just hear that I didn't make a mistake. Asterisk, he felt a small, familiar pang of loneliness. A sense that no one truly understood the genius it took to make it all seem so easy around him. The crowd was a sea of silken jewels, of glowing faces and eager eyes. A young woman, probably a music student, clutched her program to her chest as if it were a holy text, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. She was too intimidated to approach, but she couldn't look away. An older couple, wealthy patrons of the arts, spoke in loud whispers to each other. "Did you see the way he handled that arpeggio?" "Extraordinary," the woman said, fanning herself with a gloved hand. Her husband nodded sagely, though he had been more focused on the soft leather of his new seat. They were all here to be seen, to say they had witnessed the great Julian Vance, and he, in turn, used their adoration as fuel. It was a silent, unspoken agreement, but down on the floor, far from the shimmering lights in the forest of expensive shoes, another world existed. An elderly woman named Ilara moved slowly along the edge of the aisle, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. She held a long-handled dustpan in one hand and a broom in the other. Her back ached, a dull, constant throb she had learned to live with over many years. Her uniform, a simple gray dress, was worn and faded, but it was clean. She was part of the background, a piece of the hall's furniture, as permanent and unnoticed as the velvet curtains or the golden carvings on the balcony rails. While everyone else was looking up at the star of the show, Ilara was looking down. She saw the world the concert-goers left behind, a dropped earring sparkling near a chair leg, a crumpled program stuffed between the cushions, a sticky stain where someone had spilled a glass of champagne. She worked with a quiet efficiency, her movements economical and practiced. She didn't hear the music the way the critics did. She couldn't tell you the difference between a fugue and a sonata. But she had been in this hall for decades, sweeping up after every kind of performer, and she had learned to feel the music in her bones. Tonight's performance had been intense. There was a lot of noise, a lot of fast, angry-sounding notes that made her feel a bit jittery. But then there were moments of such sadness in the music that it made her think of her late husband, and the way he used to hum old folk songs while he tended his garden. She paused her sweeping for a moment, her hand resting on the back of an empty velvet seat, and let the memory wash over her. It was a brief, private moment in a room full of people. From her low vantage point, she saw the legs of the crowd. She saw polished leather shoes and elegant high heels scuffing the floor she had just cleaned. She saw the hem of a long silk dress trail on the ground, picking up dust. She saw the world from a different angle, a world of details and dirt, of the things left behind. Her gaze drifted towards the center of the aisle, where the crowd was thickest. She could see the bottom half of the famous pianist's suit, his expensive black shoes planted firmly on the carpet as if he owned the ground beneath them. He was a god to these people. To her, he was just another man in a fancy suit who made a mess, albeit a beautiful one. She had seen them come and go, the famous singers, the celebrated violinists, the genius pianists. They all shimmered brightly for a few hours, and then they were gone, leaving her to clean up the remnants of their glory. She sighed softly, a quiet puff of air in the noisy room, and went back to her work, her world and his existing in the same space, separated by an invisible wall as strong and high as any mountain. The buzz of the crowd was starting to settle into a more organized rhythm. People were forming smaller circles, their conversations becoming more focused. The great Julian Vance had finished his initial rounds of greetings and now held court in a small, exclusive pocket of admirers. The air around him was thick with compliments, each one a small offering at the altar of his genius. He accepted them with a graceful nod here, a thin smile there, but his mind was already moving on, reviewing the performance, cataloging the tiny triumphs. He felt like a king surveying his kingdom, a kingdom built on 88 black and white keys. Into this carefully curated space stepped a man who had been waiting patiently for his moment. His name was Alistair Finch, a critic whose words could make or break a young musician's career, but who, in the face of a titan like Julian, was just another supplicant. He was a thin man with a face that seemed permanently pinched, as if he had just smelled something unpleasant. He adjusted his spectacles, a nervous habit, and cleared his throat. The small group quieted, sensing that something important was about to be said. This was his chance. "Maestro Vance," Alistair began, his voice a little too loud, a little too eager. "A truly breathtaking evening. Your command of the instrument is, as always, unparalleled." He paused for effect, letting the praise hang in the air. Julian gave a slight, almost bored nod. Alistair pressed on. "But it was the final movement of your new sonata that has left me, well, utterly haunted. There is a melody within it, a simple, almost raw theme that contrasts so powerfully with the surrounding complexity. It has a folk-like quality, a beautiful, earthy authenticity. If I may be so bold, what was the inspiration for such a profound departure?" Alistair beamed, proud of his question. It wasn't just praise. It was analysis. It showed he wasn't just another fan swooning in the front row. He had listened, he had dissected, and he was asking the one question no one else had dared to. The others in the circle leaned in, their curiosity piqued. They too had felt that strange, simple pull in the middle of the storm of notes. For a brief moment, something unreadable flashed across Julian's face. It was a flicker of annoyance, quickly masked by a look of profound, almost theatrical thoughtfulness. He didn't like this question. It brought attention to the one part of the composition he felt was a weakness, a sentimental crutch he had almost cut entirely. He had buried it under layers of complex harmonies, hoping no one would notice its simple origins. But this man, this critic, had gone and dug it up. Julian let the silence stretch for a moment, enjoying the power he held. He looked at Alistair as a teacher might look at a precocious, but ultimately simple, student. He raised a hand and waved it in the air, a gesture of casual dismissal. "Ah, that," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "You have a good ear, I'll grant you that." The small compliment was a barb, designed to put Alistair in his place. But its origin is really not worth such deep thought. It's just a little peasant tune I heard years ago in some forgotten village. A trifle, really. He let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. A few of his admirers joined in, though they weren't quite sure why. "I found it charming in its simplicity," Julian continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Like a rough, uncut stone. It had a certain primitive appeal. So I took it. I refined it, gave it proper structure, a proper harmonic context. I elevated it." He said the word elevated with a special relish, drawing it out. It was the core of his philosophy, that the world was full of raw, Messy things that only achieved beauty and meaning when he, the artist, touched them. As he spoke, his eyes drifted away from Alistair, scanning the room. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just letting his gaze sweep over the lesser beings who populated his world. He needed to reinforce his sense of superiority, to find a visual anchor for his feeling of being above it all. His eyes passed over the glittering jewels, the eager faces, the expensive suits, and then they landed on her. Down near the edge of the crowd, almost in the shadows, was the old cleaner. She had stopped her sweeping and was standing perfectly still, her broom resting against her shoulder. Her head was cocked to one side, her expression distant, as if she were listening to a voice no one else could hear. She was the very picture of simplicity, of roughness. She was the uncut stone. She was the perfect living embodiment of the peasant tune he was so casually dismissing. A cruel smile touched Julian's lips. It was perfect. Here was the source of all things simple and lowly, and here he was, the man who could elevate them. But what Julian didn't see, what no one in his adoring circle could see, was what was happening inside Alara's mind. When the critic had first described the melody, her heart had given a strange little lurch. The words haunting, raw, and folk-like were not analytical to her. They were feelings. They were the smell of damp earth after a rainstorm, the feeling of a worn wooden porch swing under her legs, the memory of her grandmother's voice, thin and reedy like a flute, singing a song about a lost bird. As Julian spoke, his words like cold, sharp stones, the memory grew stronger. He called it a trifle. He said he had refined it, but Alara wasn't hearing his arrogance. She was hearing the echo of the song in her head. It was her grandmother's song, the one she had hummed to her as a child when she was sick, the one she had played on an old, out-of-tune piano in the church hall, the keys yellowed with age. It was a song about finding your way home, a song of simple, profound hope. The memory was so real, so powerful, that it pushed everything else out of her mind. The grand hall, the famous pianist, the crowd of important people, it all faded away. She was no longer an old woman in a gray uniform holding a broom. She was a little girl again, sitting on her grandmother's lap, feeling the vibration of the song in the old woman's chest. And without thinking, without any intention at all, a small, soft melody escaped her lips. It was barely a hum, a quiet thread of sound in the noisy room, but it was clear and it was pure. It was the exact, haunting melody Julian Vance was claiming as his own, played with a perfection his own elevated version had lost. The faint, almost imperceptible melody that escaped Alara's lips was like a single thread of silver in a room full of loud, clashing colors. To her, it was a private whisper, a ghost of a memory. But to Julian, it was an alarm bell. His ears, trained to detect the slightest wrong note in a 100-piece orchestra, picked it up instantly. It cut through the murmur of the crowd, the polite clinking of glasses, the soft rustle of expensive silk. It was an intrusion, a flaw in his perfect evening. His head snapped in her direction, his eyes narrowing. For a second, he didn't see the person, just the source of the sound. He saw the worn gray uniform, the stooped shoulders, the simple broom leaning against a velvet seat. And then the realization hit him, not as a thought, but as a hot, sharp spike of anger. It was that tune. The peasant tune. The one he had just dismissed, the one he had claimed ownership over by refining it. And this woman, this cleaner, was humming it. Right here. Right now. In front of everyone, a cold, calculated fury began to replace the annoyance. How dare she? How dare this insignificant creature pollute his air with a sound she had no right to? It was a challenge, even if she didn't mean it that way. It was an unspoken contradiction to his entire narrative. He had just told everyone that the tune was nothing until he had touched it, and here was its original raw form, humming away as if it had a life of its own. He felt a sudden, desperate need to crush it, to crush her. He needed to prove, not just to them, but to himself, that he was the master. He was the one who gave things meaning. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He saw his opportunity. This wasn't a problem. It was a gift. a perfect living prop for the next act of his performance. He turned his body fully towards her, a grand, theatrical gesture that immediately drew the attention of everyone in his circle. The small conversations died down. All eyes followed his pointing finger. "You, madam," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was sharp and clear, carrying an authority that silenced the room. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. Elara, who had been lost in the warm embrace of her memory, felt the cold wave of reality crash over her. One moment she was a little girl on her grandmother's lap. The next, she was an old woman in a dusty uniform, with the most famous man in the room pointing directly at her. Her heart jumped into her throat. She looked around, bewildered, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But there was no one. It was her. His finger was aimed right at her chest. The crowd turned as one, a sea of curious blank faces. They parted like the Red Sea, and suddenly she was exposed. She was no longer in the shadows, a part of the furniture. She was an island in the middle of a grand, glittering ocean, and the tide was turning against her. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up her neck, burning her cheeks. She clutched her broom handle tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Do you find something amusing?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with a false sweetness that was far more menacing than outright anger. He took a step towards her, his polished shoes making soft, predatory sounds on the carpet. The crowd watched, mesmerized. This was better than the concert. This was real drama. Elara shook her head, a small, frantic motion. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat was dry and no words would come out. She felt like a small animal caught in the headlights of a speeding car, frozen with terror. Julian saw her fear, and it fueled him. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of contempt. The sound was like glass breaking in the quiet hall. "It seems," he announced to the room, his voice booming now, "that this woman is an expert on peasant tunes." He paused, letting the words sink in, a smirk playing on his lips. "Perhaps she can offer us her critique?" And then it happened. A ripple of laughter started in the group around him. It was hesitant at first, a few nervous chuckles from people trying to please him. But Julian's confident smirk gave them permission. The laughter grew louder, spreading through the crowd like a wildfire. It was the laughter of the privileged, the laughter of people who had never known what it was like to be on the receiving end of such scorn. It was easy, effortless, and cruel. It bounced off the gilded walls and the high, ornate ceiling surrounding Elara. Trapping her, she stood there, alone in the center of the storm. Each laugh was a physical blow, chipping away at her dignity. She could feel their eyes on her, scanning her worn dress, her wrinkled face, her work-worn hands. She saw the young music student, her face now twisted with a cruel smirk. She saw the wealthy patrons, laughing openly, their faces glowing with a mixture of amusement and superiority. They weren't laughing with her. They were laughing at her. She was the butt of a joke she didn't even understand. All she knew was that the beautiful, private memory of her grandmother had been dragged out into the light, trampled on, and turned into a spectacle of her own humiliation. Her first instinct was to run, to drop her broom and flee, to escape the suffocating weight of their scorn. But her feet felt as if they were nailed to the floor. The laughter was a wall, and there was no way out. She lowered her head, her eyes stinging with unshed tears, wishing she could just disappear, melt into the carpet, become the invisible ghost she had been just a few minutes ago. The silence that had once been her companion was now a weapon, and the laughter was the sound of her world shattering into a million pieces. The laughter was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket that smothered the air in the grand hall. It pressed in on Elara from all sides, 1,000 tiny needles pricking her skin. Each chuckle, each guffaw was a reminder of her place in this world, a small, insignificant thing to be used for the amusement of the great. Her head was bowed, her eyes fixed on the worn pattern of the carpet, a swirling maze of red and gold that made her dizzy. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The beautiful memory of her grandmother, the song that had been her private sanctuary, was now lying in the dirt, trampled and defiled. And it was her fault. She had let it out, but then something shifted inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a sudden burst of courage. It was quieter than that. It was a feeling deep in her bones, a slow, steady warmth that began to push back against the cold shame. She thought of her grandmother's hands. Not soft and smooth like the people in this room, but gnarled and strong from a life of work. She thought of her voice, not trained or perfect, but true. The song wasn't Julian's to elevate. It wasn't the crowd's to laugh at. It was hers. It was a piece of her history, a piece of her heart. And she would not let them destroy it, with a breath that seemed to draw all the remaining air from her lungs. She took a step. It was a small movement. But in the suddenly charged atmosphere, it was as loud as a thunderclap. Her soft-soled shoe made a faint scuff on the carpet. The laughter didn't stop immediately, but it faltered. A few people near her noticed her movement and fell silent, their expressions shifting from mockery to confusion. She took another step, her back straightening slightly. She was no longer looking at the floor. Her eyes were fixed on a single point in the distance, the grand piano. Sitting alone on the stage like a black, gleaming altar, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. The wave of silence followed her path as she walked, slowly and deliberately, away from her corner and towards the center of the room. The people parted for her, not out of respect, but out of sheer bewilderment. They moved aside as if she were a strange, unpredictable animal that had wandered into their midst. She was no longer the butt of their joke. She was an enigma. Julian watched, his smirk frozen on his face, then slowly melting away, replaced by a look of pure fury. This was not part of his script. She was supposed to shrink, to flee, to disappear. She was not supposed to move. He opened his mouth to shout, to call security, to put an end to this bizarre spectacle. But no sound came out. He was a king who had just lost control of his own kingdom, and he could only watch as a humble subject walked towards his throne. Ilara reached the edge of the stage. She paused for a moment, looking up at the piano. It was so much bigger up close, a magnificent beast of black wood and gleaming ivory. It was the same kind of piano her grandmother had dreamed of, the kind she had only ever seen in pictures. She placed a foot on the small set of steps leading up to the stage, her movements slow and careful, as if she were afraid of breaking a spell. She climbed onto the stage and stood before the instrument. The hall was now completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights overhead. She did not sit on the velvet bench. Instead, she stood beside the piano, her hands hovering over the keys. They were not the hands of a pianist. They were the hands of a woman who had washed dishes, scrubbed floors, and held the hands of the sick. They were swollen at the knuckles and marked with the scars of a long life. But as they lowered onto the ivory keys, they moved with a strange, gentle grace, and then she began to play. The first note was not loud or commanding. It was soft, almost hesitant, like a question asked in a quiet room. But it was pure. It was the exact melody Julian had played, but it was unrecognizable. His version had been technically flawless, a perfect, polished gem. But it was cold. Her version was alive. The notes didn't just sound. They bloomed. They carried the weight of a lifetime. In the simple rise and fall of the melody, you could hear the crackling of a fire in a small hearth on a winter's night. You could feel the gentle rocking of a chair on a worn-out porch. You could hear the whisper of a mother's lullaby and the silent sob of a goodbye. It was the sound of joy that had known sorrow and of sorrow that had found a reason to hope. Her fingers, though stiff with age, found a depth of expression that Julian's perfect technique could never touch. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling the story behind them. The crowd was mesmerized. The smirks had vanished from every face. The young music student stood with her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. She realized that everything she had been taught about music, about precision and complexity, was only half the story. This was the other half. This was the soul. The critic, Alistair, felt a chill run down his spine. He suddenly understood what had been missing from Julian's performance. It had the body of the music, the perfect structure, the brilliant form, But this was the music's breath, its heartbeat. He felt like a man who had spent his life studying the anatomy of a bird, only now realizing for the first time what it meant to see it fly, and Julian stood as if turned to stone. The color had drained from his face, leaving it ashen and pale. He remembered now. He remembered the small, dusty village. He remembered the old woman with the kind eyes who had taken pity on a lost, arrogant young boy and taught him a song her grandmother had taught her. He had dismissed it then, just as he had dismissed it tonight. He had stolen it, polished it, and presented it as his own, thinking he had improved it. But hearing it now, in its true, raw form, he understood that he hadn't elevated it. He had hollowed it out. He had taken its soul and replaced it with a shiny, empty shell. The silence in the hall was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a judgment. It was the sound of his world crumbling around him, leaving him utterly, completely alone. The last note of the melody did not end. It simply hung in the air, a shimmering, transparent thread connecting every person in the hall. It was a sound so full of feeling that it seemed to absorb all other sounds, all other thoughts, leaving behind a void of pure, unfiltered emotion. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. It was thick with the weight of 100 unspoken realizations, 100 sudden pangs of guilt. It was the kind of silence that descends not when a story is over, but when a truth has just begun. Ilara's fingers rested on the ivory keys for a moment longer, as if saying a quiet goodbye to an old friend. She did not turn to the audience. She did not raise her hands in a gesture of triumph or bow her head in a plea for acceptance. She had not played for them. She had played for the song and for the memory of the woman who gave it to her. With a soft sigh, she drew her hands back, the arthritic joints protesting quietly. She turned from the piano, not as a performer leaving a stage, but as a visitor who had paid her respects and was now taking her leave. She walked down the small set of steps, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. As her feet touched the main floor of the hall, something incredible happened. The spell was broken, but the magic remained. The crowd, which had been a single, mesmerized entity facing the stage, seemed to breathe again. But their attention shifted. Eyes followed her, not with the mockery of before, but with a new, profound sense of wonder. They saw her not as a simple cleaner, but as the vessel of a truth they had just witnessed. Yet, as she moved, she began to change back. The straightness in her posture softened. The aura of authority that had surrounded her at the piano faded. She became, once again, just an old woman in a gray uniform. She walked past the spot where she had been humiliated, her broom still lying on the floor. She picked it up, the familiar worn wood of comfort in her hand. She found a discarded program near a seat leg, leaned down, and picked it up. She went back to her work, sweeping the dirt from under the chairs. As if the most profound musical moment of the evening had been nothing more than a brief, interesting interruption. The crowd watched her, silent and still. They wanted to react, to do something, but they didn't know what. To applaud now would feel like an insult, as if they were trying to buy the feeling they had just been given for free. To speak would be to shatter the fragile, sacred silence. So they just watched, a room full of powerful, wealthy, educated people, utterly humbled by a woman who was simply cleaning up their mess. The critic, Alistair, felt a tremor run through his body. He looked down at the small notebook in his hand, at the pen he had been ready to use to dissect Julian's performance. The words he had written, flawless technique, daring interpretation, commanding presence, now seemed like childish scribbles, shallow and meaningless. He had spent his life building a fortress of knowledge around music, categorizing it, analyzing it, judging it. But in those few minutes, Ilara had walked through the walls of his fortress without even trying. She had shown him that the heart of music was not in the complexity of the notes, but in the simplicity of the feeling behind them. He felt a deep, burning shame, not just for laughing at her, but for the years he had spent praising hollow men like Julian while ignoring the soulful truth that lived in the margins. He slowly, deliberately closed his notebook and put his pen away. He had nothing left to say. The young music student felt tears welling up in her eyes. She looked at her own hands, the hands she practiced with for hours every day, trying to perfect her scales and arpeggios. She suddenly understood that all her hard work was just building the frame. The picture, the real art, was something that couldn't be taught. It had to be lived. She looked at Alara, now quietly working in the corner, and saw not a failure or a joke, but a master. A master of a kind she could only hope to one day become. The path she thought she was on had just vanished, and a new, more difficult, and far more beautiful one had appeared in its place. And then there was Julian. He stood frozen, a statue carved from ash. The blood had drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, grayish white. The mask of the genius, the maestro, had been shattered, and underneath was nothing but a terrified, hollow man. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now, but they were different. The adoration was gone. The respect had evaporated. In its place was a mixture of pity and contempt. He was no longer a king on a throne. He was a thief caught in the marketplace, his pockets turned out, empty. The silence was no longer his tool. It was his accuser. It screamed the truth he had tried to bury, that he was a fraud. He had built his entire castle on a stone he had stolen from a poor woman's garden, and he had just been forced to watch her build a cathedral with it. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, to deny it all, to tell them it was a coincidence, that she was lying. But how could he? The truth wasn't in her words. It was in the music. It was a truth that everyone in the room had felt deep in their bones. He had spent his life collecting applause, but he had never before felt the crushing weight of silence. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. There were no words. There was nothing left. Slowly, people began to leave. It was not the usual chatty, excited exodus of a concert crowd. It was a quiet, somber procession. They walked with their heads down, avoiding each other's eyes. They moved as if they were leaving a funeral or a sacred site. No one went to Julian. No one asked for an autograph. They walked around him as if he were a piece of furniture they no longer had any use for. As they passed the corner where Alara was working, some of them hesitated, wanting to say something, to offer an apology, a word of thanks. But she gave them no opening. She was focused on her work, her world reduced again to the small patch of floor in front of her, a quiet, humble queen in her own small kingdom. Soon the hall was nearly empty. The velvet seats were dark and empty. The glittering lights seemed harsh and cold. And Julian was still standing there, alone in the middle of the vast, echoing space. The great pianist, the man who could command the emotions of thousands with his fingertips, was utterly, completely powerless. The only sound in the entire hall was the soft, rhythmic swish-swoosh of a broom. It was the sound of simplicity. It was the sound of truth. It was the sound of a real life being lived, sweeping away the remains of a beautiful, hollow lie. And in the profound, deafening silence, it was the only music that mattered.